Well, this could be either a really long lesson today or it could be a very short lesson today.
You might tell them where you're at since we
Oh, yes, sorry guys. We are in Mark chapter 15, verses 33 through 39. And then we're going to jump to Mark chapter 16, 1 through 8.
So we're starting
In Mark 15, verse 33.
switch things around a little bit for
To get the Easter message, yes. One thing that, as a Christian, it's a little bit of a bent. So Easter, I guess, is about Cadbury eggs and marshmallow peeps and bunnies and all that, right? Huh?
well, it is for the world.
It is for the world, right? It's that every year this time it just bothers me, when that is the focus. And I didn't get to read it. Christy had a devotional the other day, and I was complaining about this yesterday, and she kind of read that devotional to me, and basically, as Christians, there's a lot of things we're going to see in this world we don't like, we don't agree with, we don't understand. And the message of that devotional is because we're not meant for this world. And I thought, well, how, it really lines up with the way we look at the world is going to be different than the way a lot of other people look at the world. Yeah, Dan?
Well, I mean, if you're not a Christian, Christmas is about Santa Claus. And if you're not a Christian, Easter is about the Easter Bunny.
Yes.
And it's like they don't allow us to have a religious holiday. They want to take it and do something else with it.
And kind of what bothers me is stuff like Valentine's Day it's a bigger deal, to our world. Labor Day,
The bottom line is Easter and Christmas are for believers.
Yes.
And I had kids ask me about Santa Claus and Easter Bunny, and I said, you know what, I don't talk about any of those because, it's like that's real meaning, but I didn't say those are terrible because that's the thing for parents.
Sure.
That wasn't my place to do that. But I think the main thing is we can't expect the world to celebrate something that's specific.
That's not, yes.
Yeah, but how many people get really into Halloween?
Very good. And that was my gripe was, Easter falls into a second or third rate event behind the Halloweens. Like I said, even the 3-day weekends, and, I'm still working, so, well, if I get a Monday off, that's a great holiday, whatever it is, because I get that extra. Yes, yeah. Yes. It just bothers me every year as we roll up into this last week. And now one thing, we went to Tulsa yesterday, met the grandson and the daughter and even the son-in-law because it was his birthday. So so we can't make a trip to Broken Arrow or Tulsa without Christy going into Target. It's one of those great places, I guess. And they had a sign, I guess they're going to be closed on Easter. They're going to be closed today. And we was talking about that, and how some of these stores now are, and it's not about being a Christian holiday. They're taking care of their employees by giving them the day off to hunt Easter eggs or whatever they're wanting to do. But it's still nice to see.
Yeah, that's a switch for Target.
That's a switch for Target. It surprised us to see that. Those last few years I was at Lowe's, they had started doing that too. But they had a new CEO come in, and that was one of the things he initiated that first year he was there is they closed the store down. I think Terry's got it, Russ. That's what you.
Carol's got it.
Oh, Carol's got it.
Well, they kind of take God out of government, but yet the mailman doesn't deliver mail on a Sunday. I mean, if you really get into it,
But all right. So let's start with verse 33. So this is Mark chapter 15. And when the 6th hour was come, there was a darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, and I always mess this up, guys, Eloi, Eloi, lama, yes, which is, being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by, when they heard it, said, Behold, he calleth Elias. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink, saying, let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. So in the 6th hour, so verse 33, 6th hour, after a night filled with trials and physical abuse, Jesus was hung on the cross around 9 a.m. After about 3 hours, the events recorded in verses 33 through 36 took place. During those first 3 hours, the soldiers cast lots for his clothing, placed a placard that mockingly proclaimed him King of the Jews, and those around the cross shouted curses and insults at him. Even the chief priests and scribes were there, shouting and challenging him to come down from the cross to prove that he was the Messiah. These events completed the first half of Jesus' time on the cross. And then in verse 34, Eloi, Eloi, lama, Sherry? Okay, thank you. Interpreters historically interpret Jesus' citation of Psalms 22:1, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, in one of two ways. Some argue that Jesus' cries meant that he literally was abandoned or forsaken by God once he took on the sin of the world. Others argue that it was common to cite the beginning of a passage without finishing it. This suggested that the rest of the passage logically followed and could be applied. Yet others have pointed out that perhaps both are true. Jesus may have been abandoned by God, yet he was never without confidence that God would restore him through the resurrection. What's your take on that? How do you guys feel?
Would you read that again,
The last sentence? Okay. Yet others have pointed out that perhaps both are true. That Jesus may have been abandoned by God, yet he was never without confidence that God would restore him through the resurrection.
I don't like the word abandoned,
I don't either.
but turned his back in the fact that Jesus took on our sin. God can't look upon sin. And so, that Jesus knew that was coming,
Mm-hmm.
but obviously in his time of need, just like it is for us, when we feel that God needs the worst, we sometimes think he's abandoned us, truly abandoned us, but he's always there. And so to me, I think that's what it says to me, according to Terry.
And I kind of agree with that too. I think that's how I'd want to interpret it anyway.
As the human side,
Yes.
even knowing this was coming, he had to have a moment of doubt,
Yes.
and that hadn't been it.
For what he had gone through those few hours leading into that.
He probably wasn't sure that God was going to let him suffer that much, so he could have a moment of doubt.
Well, and he went through that even prior to this, when he got in prayer time with him, said, could this cup pass, do I have to take this cup or could it pass? So yes, there's the human side of him that's there. That's what it is.
Carol, Mike, you got anything?
I think he knew what was coming, and he knew it was going to be awful,
Yes.
and so he prepared for it.
Yeah.
He didn't like it, but he still had to go through it.
Still had to go through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So verse 35 says, calleth Elias. Passages such as Malachi 4, 5, and 6, and Mark 6, 14 through 15 demonstrate a clear expectation among first century Jews that Elias, or Elijah, would somehow return to help people in need. The comment in verse 35 reflects the speculation that Jesus was calling for the ancient prophet's help in his time of need. As such, anyone who thought Jesus was calling to Elijah would have been Jewish, since the Romans would have no interest in such things. The religious leaders maintained a wait-and-see attitude. And then verse 36, we'll skip down to give him to drink. Given the strict rule of the Romans, it might seem unusual that the soldiers would allow common people so close to the cross. However, they were probably not concerned as long as no one tried to rescue the condemned prisoner. Even though many scholars believe individuals were crucified just above ground level, a reed still would have been necessary to get the sponge up to Jesus' lips.
Which is interesting because in one of the other gospels, they offer him something to drink that has a little sedative in it, and he refuses it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is so different than I would have said, yes, give me anything to have.
Well, there again, not too long ago, my daughter gave birth. She wanted every medication known to man to make that an easier thing for her, you know. So how does an understanding of Jesus' suffering influence your appreciation of salvation?
You know, I was thinking of this the other day. I was thinking of just a quick death. A quick death doesn't speak to us like the excruciating death that Jesus suffered. And if we've ever studied that, and I know we all have, had nine tails and all of those things that he endured, it makes it that much more horrific. And it lasted, you know, from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And I just think that watching that endurance is so much more heart-wrenching and makes us, because God could have allowed them to kill him quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It would have still been the sacrifice, but the death spoke so much of the God's love for us.
Exactly.
When you think of the quality of procedure he had to take up, I mean, this is past, present, and future sin.
Yes.
He had added a phenomenal amount of sin. And so, just the sheer volume of what he had to endure.
It's just, I can't even I'm a simple-minded person. I can't even wrap my mind around, you know, all that. And so, all right, verse 37, and Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. And when the centurion, which stood over against him, saw that, he so cried out and gave up the ghost and said, truly, this man was the Son of God. I find it interesting that Mark brought up the centurion. Of all the people that were probably right there within hearing distance and watching all this, I found it interesting that the centurion was the one that he wanted to mention and to write about. But the centurion was not Jewish. Yes.
And had observed many crucifixions.
Yes, because as you read through this, it's like centurion. This would have referred to a Roman military commander who was in charge of 100 soldiers. It is reasonable to assume that this centurion would have been the leader of the crew and oversaw the crucifixion from start to finish. In this case, he would have seen the darkness, heard Jesus' words on the cross, and witnessed the mocking crowd. The experience convinced him that something was different about Jesus than others he had executed. Like I said, I just found it kind of neat that's, you know, like I said, of all the Jews that were right there, this is the one person he picked out.
Well, you know, each one of the Gospels tells it a little bit differently. And one of the other Gospels I was reading yesterday, I think it was probably John, who was an eyewitness. You know, he mentions the earthquake and the fact that it became completely dark from noon to 3 o'clock. Some of the graves opened up and some of the saints from old appeared and went into the town. I mean, there were, you know, John Mark just gives us one glimpse. But like I said, I'm pretty sure it was John. It was either John or Matthew, and they were both eyewitnesses. But anyway, that all of those things happened. And if I would have seen, pitch black from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and I would have seen an earthquake, even as a lost person, and she's right, these were not Jews, so they were more apt to give credence to the Lord than the Pharisees and the scribes and all of those guys. But there was more to that than just Mark said.
Yes. No, and like I said, I just found it interesting that, he picked that one person out of the crowd to point out. And then verse 39, the Son of God. Some think the soldiers simply meant that Jesus was a great man or a type of divine hero. If so, Mark included the account as a powerful demonstration of irony. Others take the statement more directly and conclude that the soldier truly came to understand who Jesus was and the gravity of what was taking place to the extent that circumstances allowed. And I agree with that last part of that. Go ahead.
As opposed to all those that were steeped in the Jewish religion, and how many times have we been told this is what's going to happen, and you recognize it?
No. Mind-blowing, isn't it? All right. So let's jump into Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they come into the sepulchre. Am I pronouncing that right? Sepulchre. Sorry. I pronounced it like 14 different ways the last 2 weeks I've been reading this. So. At the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, who shall roll away the stone from the door of the tomb? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away from it, for it was very great. And entering into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were affrighted. And he said unto them, be not affrighted, ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen, he is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way, tell his disciples and Mary that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him, and he said unto you, as he said unto you. And they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. So we could have made this real easy. There's my notes for this week. That's it. We wouldn't be here had that not happened, right? We wouldn't be sitting here in a church. That would have just been another cult that would have faded away within months, maybe a year or two, 2,000 years ago after this happened. Had he not been risen, none of this, they'd still have some documents from the Old Testament that maybe some traditional Jews would still be studying, but none of this other would have ever happened. So I think everything hinged right there on those three words. Everything that we do, we believe in, our faith is right there. And so my next part of that is, why was it the two Marys that got to be the first to hear that, to be the first witnesses? Right. But I think that's why it's important that it was those two women, right? And so, and as we, huh? Yes. Was it? No, it was his mom and a follower that had been with him for, yeah. So in verse 1, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome, women were considered highly unreliable as witnesses in Jesus' day. That Mark and the other gospel writers include this can only lead readers to conclude that it must have actually happened. For a manufactured story would not have leaned on the testimony of women in order to give their account weight. That Mark repeated their names in chapters 15 and 16 doubles down on this. The repetition emphasizes the importance of the women as witnesses. So let's skip to 3 and 4. The stone, the women likely had been discussing for some time how the stone to the tomb could be managed so they might anoint Jesus' body. Not having an answer did not deter them from going away. It was an act of faith, and one that led them to experience a supernatural occurrence. And then in getting into verse 5, the young man clothed in a long white garment. The reference to the clothing of the young man is Mark's not so subtle way of stating that he was an angel. Matthew and John references angels wearing white robes. So I truly believe it was an angel sitting in that. Mm-hmm.
And normally the females are the ones who do the cooking, the preparing, even though Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea took the body of Jesus and they had all of those spices and things. Normally, I think, I'm just making this assumption based on what I read, the women were the ones that went in to prepare, the bodies. And I got off the subject.
No, it's fine.
So anyway, didn't mean to bounce back to that.
No. And there again, I like I said, I find it interesting that it was the two ladies that discovered the empty tomb, that had the conversation with the angel, and was given the commission of going back and reporting that to the disciples. It could have been worked out. It had been, Matthew and John or Peter and, it could have worked out. They could have had it worked out, but for those two to have been chosen to get the witness. Yes. Yes.
I always thought it was strange that they wondered who was going to roll the stone away. What about the guards that they posted to make sure nobody stole the body?
Yes.
Where were they?
And there was a seal
Yeah.
put on that, so I don't know.
Now, interesting enough, if they are accurate in the tomb that's actually there, and that were indeed the tomb, actually had a window big enough behind her, and so I don't know whether that was their backup plan or not, but for me, what I've always wondered is if the disciples believed everything Jesus taught them, why weren't they there at sunup waiting to see an empty grave? That should have been the most important thing. And I think, but I think it's the same lesson for us. It takes a lot of they were scared obviously, and they had some encounters already, and it felt their life was been threatened and so on. But I think it's a good lesson for us as well.
Yes.
That's not our first thought. It's like when we have a need. No, a lot of times we try to figure it out ourselves before we go to our knees in prayer. And but I don't know. There was always a thought that kind of challenged me was, why weren't they there?
Well, and when I think of that, I think back when we studied Exodus and Leviticus, and I felt like such a hypocrite because I'm judging the Israelites for not having faith, for not trusting that God was going to provide for them, even after he had performed all those miracles getting them out of bondage in Egypt. They're still doubting all the way. I mean, they're still falling back to their old ways, which we do too. Or I won't say we, I do too. How many times do I doubt? How many times am I there again? And I've got a full Bible telling me, here's how things are. But yet, I start trying to rely on myself, which usually gets me in trouble. And that's why I'm kind of, I agree with you, Terry, that, where were the disciples? He just told them what was getting ready to happen, right? But yet they had fled. I assume that those ladies weren't on the radar for the Jewish leaders or the Roman. They were probably flying under radar, and they could probably move around and get around a lot easier than what, if they'd have seen those disciples.
Even though they had seen all the miracles, Judas still sold him out. Peter denied him 3 times.
Yes.
All of them had doubt.
Yes. Yep. And it is, there again, I don't see myself as any different nowadays in our time.
Has been through the whole process.
Right. Yep. And like I said, that's where I feel guilt whenever I'm starting to doubt and I question and I lose faith is, I guess that's human nature, right? Let's see, where did we leave off at? In verse 6, Jesus of Nazareth. By using this title, Mark simultaneously affirmed the identity of the one who was crucified and affirmed that the resurrection had taken place. By mentioning Jesus' origin, Mark emphasized that Jesus was a real historical person from a lowly, humble location. In verse 7, tell his disciples and Peter. Most of the disciples had scattered when Jesus was arrested. Later, Peter had denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Still, the angel suggested that Jesus' resurrection was especially good news for them. Likewise, we can find joy in the resurrection regardless of mistakes we have made in the past. So it's kind of made the full circle there, didn't we? In verse 8, neither said they anything. Mark stated that the women fled from the tomb in a manner not unlike that of the disciples when Jesus had been arrested. Again, fear was a motivator. But the other gospel writers point out that they did eventually fulfill their mission of telling others. So you think maybe they kind of huddled up somewhere and said, did you see what I saw? We were told to go tell it. Do you think we should? I'm sure there was a little bit of talking and planning on that too, And I mean, if you just walked into, you're expecting to see a body and you find an angel, and it's probably going to shake you a little bit, I would think,
They had just seen what Jesus went through, and they did not want to go through the same thing.
No. And like I said, I'll just fall back to He is risen. I mean, and there again, if we didn't have that, if they got there to that tomb and there had been a body sitting in that tomb, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be.
He knew how skeptical he would be. That's why he could after he was risen.
Yes.
He taught people that he was
Yes.
he did before, all these people at one time. He proved that he really was him, and that he really was alive.
And we don't get into this today, but He does come back, and there's a lot of folks get to see Him after He's died, right? So I was thinking this week, how many religious figures in history from other religions have died, and we're not all gathered up celebrating them, worshiping them, are we?
All of them. That's right.
They didn't come back.
I was listening to a snippet, you've probably all seen, we have the documentary, and we also have the book and the movie, The Case for Christ. And when Lee Strobel is an atheist, and he's saying, his wife has become a Christian, they're having marital problems as a result, but he says, he goes to a friend who's a Christian, he said, how can I disprove this? And he said, well, you're an investigator reporter, look out and try to disprove it. He said, well, where do I start? And he said, well, if the resurrection, the death, what you said is the most important thing, Ronnie, and without the resurrection, without what today represents, there is no Christian faith.
No.
There is no, you know, and the difference in religion for us is people are religious that are trying to seek something. But we have a relationship as a post where we're not trying to seek God. The Father is coming down to seek us through His Holy Spirit.
Absolutely.
So what you said is really, really, really good.
Thank you. Thank you. And I really don't have a problem with marshmallow peeps. They really are good, and I'm glad we have them this time of year. I'm only allowed a few. Christy, she kind of limits what I can intake of those, but the Cadbury eggs are good.
That's TA's, our daughter TA makes hers. Cadbury eggs. I like the chocolate bunnies. I haven't even let myself get one of these.
I was wondering if peeps were kosher.
I don't know.
They could be.
You know, I was getting ready this morning to come to church, and I had that Channel 6 news show on, you know, the Sunday morning show. I don't recall anything mentioned about Easter, but they was doing a story on Cadbury eggs. You know, so there again, we're strangers here, you know, and that devotional that Christy read this week really puts a lot back in perspective of, you know, we don't need to understand or agree or like everything that happens in our world. We're here temporary, and sometimes that's hard to remember and hard to keep in focus, but, you know, run our race, do what we're supposed to do, and that's it. All right. Terry, would you close out in prayer, sir?